In the 19th century, Britain underwent a moral revolution. Thanks to some extraordinary reformers and philanthropists, a new set of standards for public life emerged. Now, due to these do-gooders, the well-being of the poor and vulnerable was improving immeasurably.
But one area of life was to prove their toughest challenge yet, the private behaviour of their fellow Britons.
Now sex and alcohol were in the campaigners' sights.
Yes, what went on in pubs, clubs and behind closed doors was, to many do-gooders, as dangerous and therefore as valid a target for their reforming zeal as illiteracy, factory hours or filthy water. Britons liked to drink. A lot. And not unconnected with this, they were pretty keen on indiscriminate sex. Some saw that this behaviour was not just lax, it was becoming fatal. They determined that they would save their compatriots, not from greedy landlords or corrupt officials or exploitative bosses, but this time from themselves. This was a bold ambition. But was it a foolish one? Would Britain heed the warning? Would its citizens learn the value of self-restraint? What do you think?
In the 1830s, the town of Preston in Lancashire became the source of a national crusade. It was led by Joseph Livesey, a man determined to convince all Britons they'd be better off without booze. Livesey was a self-made man who'd made his fortune as a wholesaler of cheese. His industry, however, was at odds with most of his working-class fellows. He complained that they got so drunk at the weekend they habitually took what was known as St. Monday to sleep off their hangovers. Preston had long had a heavy drinking culture, but now it was getting worse.
These are pages from the trade directory for Preston in the year 1828 to 29. And under taverns and public houses, there are a stonking 86 separate establishments. But only 5 years later, 1834, the list has jumped up to 104 separate pubs. And there's a new category, retailers of beer. And under this new heading, there are an incredible 123 more names. So if you add together those people selling beer, the people selling beer in pubs, there's more people selling beer in Preston than any other single item.
The problem was by no means limited to Preston. In 1830, the government had passed the Beer Act. This deregulated its sale nationwide. Suddenly, vendors selling ale were everywhere, and they were not short of buyers. For Livesey, this was a catastrophe.
Livesey declared, to argue in favour of free trade in the article of intoxicating liquor is as absurd as requiring the druggist to leave the vessel containing poison without a label, or the toy shop to sell loaded pistols for boys' playthings. Strong words.
Livesey was already a member of a society which urged the people of Preston to temper or reduce their alcohol intake. But now he came round to the audacious view that only a message of total abstinence could turn the tide of excess.
In the Temperance Hall, which used to be here, Livesey got up and argued that the society should campaign for the giving up of all alcohol. Just 6 friends rallied to his cause. So, on Saturday night, the 1st of September 1832, when presumably most other people in Preston were down the pub, they met here and committed themselves to total abstinence by signing what came to be known as the Pledge. We agree to abstain from all liquors of an intoxicating quality, whether ale, porter, wine, or ardent spirits, except as medicines. Just over a year later, as legend has it, a friend of Livesey's, Dickie Turner, said nothing but the tea, total, will do. It marked the birth of teetotalism and the temperance revolution.
So what was it about Livesey that made the people of Preston listen to him and made him such an effective campaigner?
He was a fantastic salesman. That was his strength. Nowadays, he'd be very good at marketing. He had a wonderful manner, a humorous manner, and he was able to get the crowds in. So he's so successful that within 1 year of the pledge being taken in 1832, he had 1,000 people signed up. And it was that droll Lancashire humour. Think Les Dawson, think Frank Randall. And that's how he sold his message and had the crowds all laughing and at the same time signing up for the pledge.
So why is it so impossible now to imagine the temperance movement being successful in, say, a place like this?
Yeah, I think it's the different attitude. He was emphasising personal responsibility. And when things go wrong now, sometimes we say, well, it's the fault of so-and-so, it's social services do it, or the police, or so-and-so. And he said, no, it's not, You do it, you sort yourself out, which is quite a hard message.
This is tough love.
Tough love, yeah, tough love.
Livesey was taking on a huge challenge, but he had a plan. He applied his wit to writing temperance propaganda and maximised the power of the pamphlet.
This is one of his best. It's a spoof advert for a pub not with a jolly name like the Lamb and Flag, but the Spider and the Fly. The brewer is called Death & Co, and it's come up with a new drink called Maddle Brain. If you haven't got the joke by now, Livesey makes it even clearer by telling you that Death & Co assure their customers that no establishment sells better poison, breaks more hearts, or beggars more family than theirs.
Challenging people about their drinking habits has never been easy.
Good morning, I'm just handing out a few temperance leaflets here. You've got to take this, it's about the evils of drinking.
Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. God bless you, my friend.
Have a leaflet.
Jesus loves you very much.
Preston was known as a town that didn't booze. Is it now a town full of boozers? Any teetotalers left here? None. Not one. Anyone here still drinking?
Yeah.
We've got the highest rate of alcoholism, drug addiction, abortion, sexual disease in Europe, and we're headed for big, big trouble.
Do you think there is a problem with booze?
Yeah, I have a problem.
Livesey didn't stop with pamphleting. He also devised a riveting lecture on the evils of malt liquor that he toured from Preston around the northwest. And the lecture had an explosive message.
Livesey produced 4 ounces of proof spirit, which he said he distilled from 2 pints of beer. He then took proof spirit and poured it into the bowl. And then Livesey told the audience that's what's happening to the coating of your stomach and to your liver. Now, we may find the science of that a bit dodgy, but at the time, the audience were deeply affected. A man from Burnley told him, "I've had as much of that stuff as would light all the lamps in Manchester."
By 1835, it was estimated that 48,000 people had signed the pledge in England, and that 2,000 hardened drunks had been reformed. This was not nearly enough for Livesey. He had set his sights on converting the entire country to abstinence, and anything less was failure. To make matters worse, some who'd originally taken the pledge had already lapsed.
In 1837, Livesey wrote, "Of late, it has been a matter of deep lamentation that so many temperance members have returned, like the dog to its vomit, or the sow who has washed to wallowing in the mire." Not exactly flattering comparisons, but then Livesey did believe that abstinence was a mark of social progress, and the fact that the British were much more attached to alcohol than he'd believed must have been very disappointing. But he shouldn't have been so hard on himself. He did start a national movement whose effects would be felt throughout the next century, and he did it with humour, verve and conviction.
And what Livesey started, others took up enthusiastically. By the 1840s, the teetotal campaign was developing an independent London base, with a new set of supporters. One was the illustrator and comic artist George Cruikshank. Livesey had applied wit and showmanship to promoting the temperance cause. Now Cruikshank resolved to turn his artistic talents to pursuing its goal. Cruikshank came late to temperance. In his youth, he'd been a keen drinker. Though he'd seen his own father die from too much alcohol, George rarely said no to a glass or two. Berated by his family for his drinking, and often short of cash, Cruikshank knew all too well the havoc gin and beer could wreak on human lives. It became a subject he returned to repeatedly in his work. In 1847, he created The Bottle, a cautionary tale told in pictures. An overnight success, it even became a magic lantern show, the movies of its day. The story tells the highly moral, if somewhat cliched tale, of a prosperous married man who seems to have it all. But as a love of drink takes hold, it corrodes his health, his happiness and his family life. Everything is subordinated to his desire for alcohol. Eventually, his youngest child dies. He kills his wife in a fight and ends up a wreck, shut up in an asylum.
So, murder, madness and infant mortality. Not exactly a feel-good film.
When the chairman of the National Temperance League saw The Bottle, he asked Cruikshank why, given he was clearly aware of the evils of alcohol, he continued to drink himself. Cruikshank realised he could no longer avoid the logic of his own images. He signed the pledge.
Despite its success, not everyone thought that the message of The Bottle was a sound one. One of the doubters was Cruikshank's own friend, Charles Dickens. Dickens believed that it was circumstances which drove the moderate drinker to become an excessive one. And with The Bottle, a rift opened up between the pragmatic Dickens and the increasingly fundamentalist Cruikshank.
When it came to drinking, Dickens was a libertarian. who despised the idea that anyone should tell him how to live his life. He hated the temperance movement's increasingly absolutist stance. Matters came to a head in 1853, when Cruikshank published a series of fairy stories, reinvented as morality tales, to promote the temperance cause. In his versions, the crimes of ogres, giants, and bad parents were all fed by a love of alcohol. Dickens was incensed, and he retaliated in print, in an article he called Frauds on the Fairies.
Dickens raged against Cruikshank's didacticism, arguing that charming, timeless fairy tales shouldn't be sullied with references to contemporary moral or political issues. Dickens goes on to compose a satirical fairy story, Cinderella, who joins the Band of Hope, the young person's temperance movement, gets visited by the fairy godmother, who insists that the pumpkin, which is going to be turned into a coach, comes from one of the American states where they've got prohibition. And then when she gets to the ball, the handsome prince turns out to be a temperance speaker. Cruikshank wasn't amused. And worse than that, he was hurt. He thought he and Dickens were on the same side. Weren't they both for the poor, against social injustice? Now he was being made a figure of fun. Dickens said this is treating the public like they're babies. Why was that so effective as a counter-argument?
Well, it's true, of course. That's why it's effective. I mean, it is nanny-ish. It is intrusive. It's intolerable. It's priggish on one level. But on the other hand, alcohol is a very strong lure. And by the 19th century, there were so many poor drinking so much gin that it was a pathetic sight, and you can understand why people wanted to stop it. The cliché of the man coming out of work and spending the week's wages in the pub before he got home to his wife and many children was true, and it was wrecking human lives.
Cruikshank was still convinced that his art could sway the great mass of drinking Britons. In 1859, he embarked on his magnum opus. Nearly 3 years in the making, today it's held by the Tate Gallery.
This is the most extraordinary, vast depiction of British society, from top to bottom, corrupted by alcohol. And the technique is to go from the bottom of the picture, which is a scene of agreeable middle-class events, a christening, a birthday, a wedding, in which everyone's having a few, but it's not out of hand, and the excess rises up through the picture until you end up with a nightmare vision of where this ends. And the top right is a lunatic asylum. There's a man being hanged above the jail. There's the workhouse, the Magdalen homes, which were for unmarried mothers, and the police station here, the ragged school. And what Cruikshank does in the picture is show you all the professions setting a bad example. So you've got a judge here being shocked when a barrister's saying this man has led a life of drink and it's led to his downfall. But just above, there's a happy scene with the judge entertaining all the barristers and other lawyers, and what are they doing? They're all getting sozzled. Same is true just above. There's a soldier being flogged for drunkenness. What's happening in the officers' mess? The officers, they're all getting pissed. And he does it again. He does it with clergymen. You've got the nonconformist ministers with a Hindu. The mission to the Hindu, and the Hindu's going, I'm not quite sure about this. Look at that drink you're putting away. So you have all these scenes, and then the picture collapses into the middle, which is a nightmare vision of drunkenness, violence, debauchery, and destitution. The most violent image right in the middle is a man thumping a naked woman who's carrying a child right in the throat. And the violence is all around him. there's a man shooting another man here with a rifle. Just like that, bang. And it's not just the men fighting, there's women here, more or less scratching their eyes out. I mean, the police are meant to be helping, presumably, restore some sort of order. They're all drunk themselves. And there in the centre of the picture is Bacchus himself, the god of drink, being worshipped. And underneath there's a sort of bar, and the rabble are handing over anything to get hold of the booze. There's a man there offering, look, here's my child. And the central worshipper, who embodies the madness of the whole society, is a madman. And he's dancing in a frenzy, dancing on a tomb. That's where you're going. You lose everything to drink, all your friends, all your family, everything you ever owned, and the end result of it is this, the mob, violent, angry, dissolute, impoverished, and eventually dead.
Despite Cruikshank's extraordinary efforts, the worship of Bacchus was not a hit with the public. A friend of Cruikshank's did attend the exhibition and described a really pathetic scene. There was a wild, anxious look in his face when he greeted me. While we talked, he glanced once or twice at the door when we heard any sound from that direction. Were they coming at last? The tardy, laggard public for whom he bravely toiled for so long? Yet it was near noon, and only a solitary visitor had wandered into the room. Cruikshank had damaged his reputation. The public did not want to be attacked in such a head-on, strident way. And he now became to many a figure of fun. He died here at his home in Camden in 1878. He was 85. But when his will was read, it revealed an extraordinary secret, one that Cruikshank had concealed for over 20 years.
Despite his ostensibly happy marriage, it emerged that Cruikshank kept a mistress and a family less than 2 minutes' walk from this, his official home. Adelaide Archibald worked for the Cruikshanks as a housemaid, and when she left their employ, she gave birth to her former boss's child, and then went on to bear him another 10. On his death, Cruikshank left a trust for Adelaide, but most extraordinarily left instructions that all his wines, kept at her home, should be passed on to her. Does this make Cruikshank a hypocrite? Well, he never campaigned for sexual continence in the way he did for temperance. But what about the wine? Was it just a sound financial investment, or was he nipping up the road and drinking it on the quiet? We just don't know. Either way, the revelations suggest that when the Punch obituary stated, "Never has there lived a simpler, purer, more straightforward or altogether more blameless man," they were pretty wide of the mark.
Temperance was not the only attempt by do-gooders to police personal behaviour. Some also battled against an associated problem, just as intractable and destructive as heavy drinking: the vice trade. The Victorians called it the great social evil. To them, it corroded all society, tarnishing not just the physical and moral health of prostitute and client, but also wives infected with disease by errant husbands and children born out of wedlock into squalor and misery. In London alone, according to contemporary estimates, anywhere from 10 to 80,000 women were involved in prostitution.
The Victorian public imagination was very much captured by prostitutes. On the one hand, they saw the prostitute as an agent of real social contagion and chaos within the city. She symbolised the evils of the industrialised world. She represented the lustful sins of the flesh out there in the public domain. But on the other hand, she was also seen as a very innocent, suffering victim as well of male sexual vice.
In the late 1840s, one man in particular became a familiar face amongst the local streetwalkers. Night after night, he would scour the streets looking for a girl who caught his eye. But he was not your typical punter. He didn't want to sleep with the girls, he wanted to save them. He called this rescue work, and he pursued this mission for 40 years. And it wasn't his only achievement. He just happened to be the greatest reformer and statesman of the Victorian age. He had a ministerial career which spanned 60 years, 4 times Chancellor and 4 times Liberal Prime Minister. He was William Gladstone.
Gladstone was a remarkable politician, but an even more remarkable man. All his life, he made a concerted effort to live virtuously. He once listed 39 reasons why it would not be incompatible for a devout Christian to attend a ball. Gladstone's religious motivation led him to believe that he should regularly perform acts of private charity towards the neediest in society. In 1848, he found a way of combining this with his late-night sittings at Westminster. As Gladstone walked home, he approached West End prostitutes. Thanks to his scrupulous diary entries, we have some of the details of these encounters.
2nd of May 1850, conversation at night with an unhappy woman. 29th of April 1852, saw a person at night who opened a new chapter in human calamity to me. 28th of May 1852, saw one late and advised, a broken creature. 12th of February 1853, gave one 5 shillings at night to go home. And don't forget that the morning after, all those nights before, Gladstone would get up and go and run the country. When Gladstone arrived back late to this house, he sometimes had in tow a prostitute who he'd offered a meal and a bed for the night, and he was often greeted by his wife, Catherine. She's believed to have supported his efforts, but exactly what she thought about this arrangement is not recorded. However, she was a serious do-gooder herself, and their shared opinion about active charity made theirs a strong marriage.
They were together for almost 59 years and had 8 children.
But in the early days of their marriage, she preferred to live at their Welsh home with the children. This created problems.
In Catherine's absence, Gladstone's rescue work intensified. And sometimes concern can grow into obsession. In 1859, aged 49, Gladstone befriended Marion Summerhayes. No streetwalker, she was a higher class of prostitute and had at one time worked as an artist model. Gladstone now took the unconventional step of commissioning her portrait.
He was immediately struck by her beauty and her loveliness. He sort of noted this in his diary in Italian, which is always when he wanted to wax lyrical or indeed keep things a little more private. And he became more and more obsessed. And there are numerous comments in his diary which were, sort of, to us, highly suspect.
On the 1st of September 1859, he wrote, "My thoughts of Summerhayes require to be limited and purged."
Whatever that meant, it obviously wasn't very successful, because a fortnight later, he spent 4.5 hours with her reading Tennyson's epic poem, The Princess, together, after which he wrote, he was much and variously moved. Gladstone himself was far from blind to the erotic potential of his encounters, and he knew that sometimes he strayed into morally compromising territory.
In his diary, he used to put this little mark with a whip sign next to days on which he'd had an encounter. I think probably what he did was he was given a whip by Dr. Pusey, the famous High Church divine, and I think what would happen is if poor old Gladstone got a bit too excited talking to one of these girls, he'd come home and give himself 6 of the best.
There was certainly a darker side to Gladstone's rescue work. But one of the problems was, because he was so tempted by some of these women, he felt that he should put himself more in their company to actually be able to fight off this temptation and show himself, and indeed God, that he was capable of resisting.
Today, despite the involvement of the state, it still seems we need individuals committed to going out and offering a helping hand directly. Diane Martin is now the director of Trust, a Christian-inspired project assisting prostitutes in South London. Tell me why, when you started, you felt you had to do it. Was it a religious impulse?
Religious impulse. I didn't feel like I had to do it. I think for me, because I had been exploited through prostitution as a young person, in the back of my mind, I felt that I wanted to respond in some way.
And when you started it, it was just you going out at night?
It used to be, actually, we started on Sunday afternoons, and there was a group of us, and it started off as a local church project, going out on Tooting Common, looking like stalkers or ramblers with a backpack, coffee, hobnobs, contact cards with my mobile number and condoms in our backpack as well.
You had condoms
yes,
in the backpack?
Yeah.
OK, what sort of response do you get? They don't think, oh, ghastly do-gooders, we don't need any help.
We've actually never had a negative reaction. But quite early on in the early days, we did have someone see another woman and introduce us. And I remember her saying, oh, come and shouting out across the common, come and meet the Christian ladies. And I just thought I should be embroidering something or wearing a pith helmet or something like that.
So is it a bit odd for a man to be going out in the middle of the night looking for prostitutes to help? I'm thinking of Gladstone, obviously.
I like the thought of him being in Parliament, working till 12, walking home and not turning a blind eye to what he saw. And not just turning a blind eye, but opening a wallet. Yeah. And he opened his front door and took people home. Now, I love the idea of that, and I've always thought, you know, in terms of the church, if we all did that, wouldn't that be great? But then what happens is you become a charity, you have to behave yourself a little bit more, health and safety, all that kind of stuff gets in the way, what's appropriate, you know. But I think,
well, that's the joy of the Victorians, isn't it? They just did it.
Yeah, they just went and did it.
Regardless of his sometimes complex motivations, Gladstone's commitment to assisting London prostitutes lasted most of his adult life. In that time, he gave over £80,000, that's the equivalent of roughly £4 million today, to homes for them to stay in and to learn a trade. Gladstone made time to become involved personally, as well as politically, with people at the bottom end of the ladder. And in many ways, this great Prime Minister and great reformer epitomised all that was best about this age of philanthropy. And how often nowadays do you hear about a politician trying directly to help the poor without a camera crew or a press officer in tow? In private, Gladstone may have been committed to the welfare of prostitutes. But unfortunately, as Chancellor, he voted for an extraordinarily draconian act of legislation affecting British women. Faced with an escalation in sexually transmitted infections amongst the armed forces, in 1864, the government passed the Contagious Diseases Act, a law that ruthlessly targeted women as the problem rather than men.
In key garrison towns and naval ports, women suspected of being prostitutes would have to register, submit themselves to an examination to prove that they were clean, and if they failed the test, would be incarcerated in hospitals until they were pronounced cured. It seemed a bold and pragmatic idea, but when the act was put into practice, it created a huge public outcry.
One problem was that the Contagious Diseases Act affected not just prostitutes, but also ordinary women.
Under the legislation, women living within a 10-mile radius of any army camp or naval port, which was specified in the Acts, could be picked up simply on suspicion of being a prostitute, which might simply mean that they were walking down the street at 8 or 9 o'clock at night when any respectable woman either would have had a chaperone with her or been back in her home. All women, whether they're found to be suffering with venereal disease or not, are registered. And once you were registered as a prostitute, whether or not there was any hard evidence for that, it had a massively detrimental effect on women's lives in terms of their social standing and their reputation.
It had become brutally apparent that society had one set of rules for men and another for women, something some now dared say publicly. But one pioneering woman went further and decided to try and tackle this problem at its core by trying to persuade men of the error of their ways. Elise Hopkins was a do-gooder who lectured others about sex without, as far as we know, ever having had any herself. The bookish daughter of a Cambridge don, she began her good works as a feisty Christian evangelist. And she once received 2 stems of Brussels sprouts from a labourer as a thank you for converting him. When her father died, Hopkins settled in Brighton, a town with its fair share of vice. In the 1860s, the local police estimated that 350 prostitutes worked here, and that there were 97 brothels. Hopkins now began to visit the local prostitutes to try to help them. But after over a decade of hearing the poignant stories of the women, she decided a different strategy was called for.
Hopkins came to think that prevention was better than cure. In her own words, better a fence at the top of the cliff than an ambulance at the foot. In 1879, she wrote an essay throwing down the gauntlet. She boldly criticised the Church of England for only dealing with the consequences of sexual immorality in its homes for fallen women and failing to tackle the real problem, the behaviour of the nation's men. It was their money that allowed prostitutes to ply their trade, and, she said, it was their false promises that tempted good women to stray and become prostitutes in the first place. She declared, "My inmost soul yearns for some agency that could infuse in young men a strong and passionate sense of the pitiful meanness of it all, the utter unmanliness of crushing and degrading women, inflicting them with a curse which they do not share with so much as their little finger."
4 years later, she got her wish. In 1883, along with the Bishop of Durham, she set up an organisation with the ambitious aim of getting men to be chaste. It was called the White Cross Army.
White stood for purity, army for disciplined strength, and the cross for the overarching belief that the struggle was in the name of Christ. And the rousing motto came from the words given by the poet Tennyson to Sir Galahad. "My strength is as the strength of 10, because my heart is pure."
The White Cross Army was inspired by the late Victorian vogue for the medieval idea of chivalry. It was typified in tales where noble knights served and protected defenceless damsels.
The White Cross Army drew up its own chivalric code and, like with the Temperance Pledge, urged its adherents to sign up. And the promises were: 1. To treat all women with respect and to endeavour to protect them against wrong and degradation. 2. To put down all indecent language and coarse jests. 3. To maintain the law of purity as equally binding upon men and women. 4. To endeavour to spread these principles amongst my companions and to try and help younger brothers. 5. To use all possible means to fulfil the command, keep thyself pure. Not much of an ask? To us nowadays, this seems deeply conservative and quite funny. But in the 1880s, what Hopkins was doing and saying was truly radical. In a society run by men, where men made all the rules, she was daring to say, you need to think again about what being a good man is.
For the next 4 years, Hopkins tirelessly toured the country, speaking on a subject few polite women would ever refer to in public: male sexual desire. She addressed mass meetings of mostly working class or university men, urging them to join her cause. Public speaking, however, was only one part of a two-pronged attack.
Hopkins wrote a series of little pamphlets for men, and this one, True Manliness, was a bestseller. It was published in 1883 and sold 300,000 copies in its first year. It was reprinted again and again over the next 30. It was even sent out to British troops in India in order to give them pause for thought. Basically, it's a fairly primitive sort of sex education for men, trying to teach them about their sexual desires and how to control them. And Hopkins uses the metaphor of a rider and a horse, the rider being man's intelligent life and the horse being his baser instincts. This will give you a flavour of it. There is nothing low or vile in the animal body in itself, just as there's nothing low or vile in the horse in itself, as long as the man is uppermost and the beast is undermost. It's only when the animal throws the rider and drags him through the dirt at his heels, only when the man obeys the beast rather than the beast obeying the man, that disorder and death ensue. The man or the maddened beast? Which is it to be? Luckily, she gives some practical help in how to control that beast. Take plenty of exercise. Go in strongly for cricket, boating, athletics of all kinds. Bicycling, tricycling. Break your nose if you like. Only don't break a woman's heart and smash your own manliness by making the weak suffer so that you may have a good time of it.
Unfortunately, Hopkins' immense productivity had a shattering impact on her health. Eventually, she was forced to retire from public life. She lived on as an invalid in Brighton for 16 years, still writing books on sex education.
Unlike those of many 19th century do-gooders, Hopkins' former home is not adorned with a blue plaque. In fact, she is barely remembered at all. The White Cross Army has long since been disbanded, and the idea of social purity doesn't really interest anyone anymore. But she should not be forgotten. In an age where the moral responsibility for sex was assumed to lie almost entirely with the woman, she tried to change the cultural status quo. She spoke out bravely on issues which were widely considered taboo and dedicated herself, and ultimately sacrificed her health, to try and improve women's lives. She may seem an odd sort of feminist to us,
But in her time, she was an original thinker and a powerful voice in stirring up a complacent national male conscience. Despite Hopkins' tireless contribution, erasing the sexual double standard was a tall order. It took 20 years for Gladstone's government to repeal the notorious Contagious Diseases Act. And even 120 years on, that double standard is still something that educators find hard to address. Daniel Macmillan works for Brooke Sexual Health Services and runs workshops for groups of young men and women on sex and relationships.
If Elise Hopkins were around today, I think she'd have a mix of disappointment and hope. Young men are opening up more. They are having conversations about love and trust and caring relationships. But disappointment that the level of responsibility amongst young people seems to be dropping. The men still rely on women to take on the caring role, not only at home, but in their own relationships. Or sometimes they'll talk quite degradingly about girls in their peer group. But you say anything bad about a young man's mother or sister, he's ready for a fight, you know? But somehow fails to make the link between his mother and sister and the fact that the girls he's talking about are somebody's daughter or sister as well. I think it's a poor indictment on society, really, about how far we've moved on.
Back in mid-Victorian Britain, government was getting bigger and expanding into the realm of the do-gooder. The public's strong reaction against the Contagious Diseases Act demonstrated that sexual behaviour was a minefield for legislators and best avoided. Nonetheless, Prime Minister William Gladstone was optimistic that he might have more luck calling time on that other vice, boozing. In 1871, his government introduced a controversial bill to reduce pub opening hours.
The bill went down badly on all sides. The staunch teetotalers who favoured abolition claimed it didn't go far enough. Other social reformers, including Joseph Livesey, objected on the grounds that the bill attacked the means of providing drink rather than the causes of drinking. Meanwhile, the brewers, the publicans and the drinkers were all furious. 800,000 of them signed a petition against the bill, which eventually appeared in a watered-down form, but it was still too much for the spirit of John Bull. When the police tried to enforce earlier closing hours, there were riots, many of them accompanied by raucous choruses of Rule Britannia, with stress on the defiant words, "Britons never, never, never shall be slaves." Gladstone lost the subsequent general election, and he declared, "We have been borne down in a torrent of gin and beer."
It seemed Britons had strong opinions about how far they were going to let their government intrude into their private lives, even if their behaviour was leading to poverty, sickness and an early grave. But in the face of all evidence to the contrary, some do-gooders still thought it was a fight that could be won. One such uncompromising idealist was Frederick Charrington, who, when he was 20 in the 1870s, witnessed a scene which would change the course of his life. Charrington was walking past an East End pub in a particularly miserable part of the city when he witnessed a young woman with 2 children in tow begging her drunken husband for help. "Oh, Tom," she pleaded, "do give me some money. The children are crying out for bread." He was deaf to her pleas and simply thumped her. She slumped to the ground. Charrington was appalled. When he looked up, he saw his own family's name. Charrington's family owned one of the biggest breweries in London, and they'd always assumed that he would one day take over the business. But now he gave up his inheritance worth £1.25 million and swore he'd devote his life to expunging the worst vices of the poor. Charrington waged war on what he considered the greatest moral danger facing the people of the East End. The music halls, which he called music hells.
Will ya, won't ya, buy some beer? Only just half a pint.
Their patrons found them a good place to forget your troubles after a hard day's work. Not so Charrington. To him, they were a sleazy hotbed of intoxication and fornication.
Won't ya buy some beer?
One of his key battlegrounds was Wilton's, a theatre near the East End docks, just off the notorious Radcliffe Highway.
Charrington decided to go straight to the heart of the viper's nest. In February 1877, he took over Wilton's on Sunday nights to put on his own show, a religious service championing self-restraint and temperance and offering redemption. The audience was the usual mix of local lowlife, a lot of sailors and girls of loose character associated with them. But whilst they may have been drawn out of curiosity, even disbelief, many of them left inspired by Charrington's vigorous Christianity.
Of course, weekly meetings, however successful, did little to dilute the popularity of the music halls.
Charrington turned to direct action. He took to demonstrating outside theatres night after night, handing out leaflets aimed to dissuade patrons and prostitutes from entering the premises. These were entitled "This Way to the Pit of Hell," which is quite off-putting if you were hoping for a jolly night out.
When this failed, Charrington tried to co-opt the law. He won a seat on the London County Council, now responsible for granting alcohol licences. When any music hall requested one, he opposed it. But his fellow councillors refused to back him. They knew what their electorate wanted.
The case was summed up by one journalist who wrote, "We do not want to be made moral by a paternal council, any more than we wish to be made sober by an Act of Parliament. And the sooner the council turns itself to its own business, the better we shall be pleased."
Unable to change society, Charrington took the ultimate step for the do-gooder and set out to build his own. In 1903, he bought an island called Osea, only 40 miles from London, off an estuary in Essex. Here he pursued his vision to create a temperance colony and a home for recovering inebriates.
This is Rivermere, a large, luxurious manor house in a prime, south-facing location on the edge of the shore. It had everything for a perfect English seaside holiday. Except no beer after a bracing walk, no claret with supper, and no port in the billiard room. It was going to be fun without drink. Charrington had high hopes of spending time on the island himself. He liked to quote the 18th century English poet William Cowper on the pleasures of island life. "I am monarch of all I survey, my right there is none to dispute."
But dispute it they did. And before too long, there was trouble in paradise. Osea was meant to be entirely dry, but stories soon began to circulate of recovering alcoholics bribing local fishermen to smuggle in booze.
One method was to tie bottles to trees and posts along the shoreline, submerged, so that then when the tide went out, they could scamper down, pick them up, and no one would know.
Despite these setbacks, Charrington was still convinced that his utopia had a glorious popular future.
Osey was going to be a rival to Brighton or Southend, but without the drunken excesses of the day trippers who flocked to those resorts.
As it happened, the advent of the First World War put a stop to Charrington's grander plans for Osey. But it's doubtful that it would ever have lived up to his high expectations.
The problem was, and is, that people always want a Brighton or a Southend. There's only a certain amount of do-gooding that the country will put up with, even from someone as well-meaning as Frederick Charrington. Drink is a terrible social evil, and I'm going to help you cope with the consequences. Yeah, OK. I'm going to stop you drinking anything ever again. No thanks. Not for us, no.
We may have rejected the likes of Charrington, but that doesn't mean, as with prostitution, that we've yet found a solution to the nation's desire to overindulge in booze and its consequences.
I think there probably is an epidemic of excessive drinking in Britain. The statistics would bear that out. The cost of the health service would bear that out. The drunks in the streets, the misbehaviour on Friday and Saturday nights, I think that's probably the tip of the iceberg. There are huge numbers of people who would not for 1 second consider that they have an alcohol problem, who are drinking excessively and put themselves at risk of developing serious and even fatal disease related to their alcohol consumption. If temperance members visited the centre of most towns or cities in the country at the weekend, I think they would be both amazed and distressed by what they saw. And I think they would be rushing very rapidly to the nearest church to find some divine inspiration as to what to do next.
Recently, Osey again became a dry island. For 5 years, it operated as a centre which offered help to alcoholics and other addicts. Society still has problems with excessive alcohol and devalued sex. We still have problems with poverty, neglect and abuse. And we are still suspicious of people who believe they can do something about it.
Like our Victorian ancestors, we bristle at the idea of the authorities telling us how to live our lives. And yet we demand that those very authorities step in and sort it out the minute something goes wrong. We say no to the nanny state, yet we expect the welfare state to protect everyone. We look to professionals to make a difference, to teachers, to policemen, to social workers, rather than doing it ourselves. The great do-gooders haven't been fashionable for a long time now. Their achievements underrated, their absurdities accentuated. But I think as time passes and we look at them again, less sure of ourselves in the 21st century, we may be ready for the tide of opinion to turn.
Tomorrow at 9, an amazing journey which takes us back 2,000 years to Pompeii to uncover life and death, with a taster of that on the way in just a sec. Over on BBC 4 now, taking a look at the struggle for freedom between East and West in Berlin.